Hello, everyone. We're back for a new program of Intelligent Disclosure. I'm Richard, and this is Tracy.
Hi, everyone.
This is probably the one program where we were preparing like right up to the last second.
Yes, we were. Yeah, there's a little bit of scrambling going on right before we started.
I have a really interesting program planned for you tonight. Just want to mention Tracy's still got a cough.
No, I can't shake it.
What's up with that? But we're gonna keep you alive.
I know.
You're gonna be good.
I'm sorry. If I have a fit, I'm gonna leave until it's over.
She can't help it.
I can't help it.
It's been like this for weeks.
I know. It's embarrassing, and what can you do?
There's water there. Just
got some
help
water.
yourself.
We've all been through it. It's just lingering.
It won't go away.
Yeah.
We came back from a cruise. My first ever. Your first and a half.
First and a half.
Let's say that.
Yeah. The first one was a couple days. My friend got really sick and I never saw the outside of the room.
Yeah, that doesn't really count.
So I'm not counting it. This was a real cruise and we were so amazed at how wonderful it was. And the group was amazing.
This was for MUFON. Okay. So it wasn't just us having a vacation. MUFON invited us, me, to do some presentations. We went and met a lot of other individuals interested in the UFO subject. Several members from our website, Richard Dolan members. That was wonderful. And overall, we just had a very positive experience with a lot of folks talking about fascinating subjects.
Yeah, we got to meet absolutely everyone because it was a really nice small group. And everyone's got a story. You know,
totally.
Everyone's got a story. So it was just really, really fun hanging out with everybody.
We got to look out at the water and we heard several USO stories as well, including one from a witness in the Yucatan who had a very, very fascinating story indeed. But we'll have to get into all that another time.
Overall, it was wonderful. Yeah. And we're thinking about next year.
All right.
We liked it that much.
We shall see. We'll see how that goes. Oops, that was me. I just moved the camera. So, I'm going to talk about Russian/Soviet UFO encounters. Before I do that, this is a fascinating subject. I've studied this for a while. There are a lot of people who know much more than I do about it, but I've got a lot to share with you. Before that, I just wanted to say there's a number of other subjects that I would like to cover here. An Intelligent Disclosure with you.
But not tonight.
So
upcoming episodes.
But there's quite a few. I think we were talking about maybe doing one more episode on alien captures, alien technology, crash retrieval, bodies, whatnot. And I think there's at least one more good full-length presentation on that. I would like to talk about the implications of what happened in the news just today, the European Parliament passing the the copyright protection law that they've been talking about for several years, including the infamous Article 13 and Article 11. Lots to say about that. Other people are already commenting on that around the web. I encourage you to get into this, but this is really another death knell for freedom of inquiry. Particularly in Europe, but it will have repercussions throughout the world. There's no question about it, and it's just another chopping off of what is a free society and free inquiry and free expression and so forth. It's a real problem. A number of other things I really want to get into, but we're going to talk about the Russians today.
Yes.
You were getting into this.
Okay, I was getting so into this one story that I was almost late joining you guys.
We're not even going to get into the details tonight.
No, we have to save it for later.
We'll do this one later, but this is the Detlef Pass.
That's right, incident, yeah.
Want to talk about that?
Well, just very quickly, a fascinating incident that happened in February 1959 in Soviet Union, and it involved 9 experienced hikers/skiers. The person leading it was a very experienced mountaineer, and there were all of these mysterious. They ended up. They were all found dead, and there were very mysterious circumstances around what the search party found and what the investigators found. They ended up closing the case after 3 months. I need to confirm this, but I heard it was classified.
Right.
So
There's definitely, it was a very, very strange situation. A lot of folks who studied UFOs have heard of it. Not a lot of people know the details, though. But as you were
oh, I
saying,
know lots of details
and
that I
she's-
want to share. It's like, I want to do this one tonight. I know lots of details, and I really look forward to sharing that with everyone. My, because this was in the upper snowy mountains, right? My sister and I both worked on the mountains, and my sister was actually involved in. She had her bomb ticket, and she had a search and rescue avalanche dog. She worked as ski patrol. I also worked on the mountain, not in the same capacity. I was teaching,
and not the Russian mountains, let's say, but the
No,
Canadian, but
Canadian.
nonetheless.
Right. But I phoned her today when I heard some of these details and some of the injuries, and to find out if these were consistent with people that they would find that were buried under avalanches. And so I have a lot of really interesting details from what she told me.
In general, I think she said yes.
Yes,
a lot
that
of the injuries
they
were
were
consistent with an avalanche.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just some things. I mean, a lot of people have general knowledge about them, but
Right.
and my sister hates talking about it because it is so horrible what happens to people, you
Yeah.
know. But bodies do sink down, and people end up suffocating. So, but there, without going into it, I could go into so many details right here, but I'm not going to, because we're not going to go into the whole thing, right?
Well, we can come back to it, but basically, I mean, it's a mysterious case in many ways. They go off; they weren't seen alive again. They were found dead months later.
They were all separated.
Yeah,
They were in. So there were 2 found by a tree. There were 4 found in a ravine.
they
And
cut their way out of the tent.
They cut their
Right.
way from the inside of the tent. Yet outside of the tent, their footprints of all 9 going down the hill were of people who were in a calm state. I grew up in a lot of snow. If you're running in the snow, your footprints are very different than if you're just, gently walking in the snow.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it seems they came out in this flurry in the evening, but then they calmly walked down. They didn't have a lot of clothing with them.
So they walked out without seemingly a lot of clothing, but calmly. Is that what you're getting?
Yes, some of them had a lot of clothing, but some of them did not. Now, some of them were found to have alcohol in their system, but I read a lot of the details, but I still have more questions that I need to find the answers to.
There is a alleged apparent UFO connection to this from other witnesses who believe they saw lights.
That's
in
right.
The area.
There was one group of hikers that were further down the mountain that reported that night, so at the same time that they had seen these 3 spherical lights. Now, there were several reports in the area, including military people, that had reported them before and after this. But so this is sort of the mysterious UFO connection, that was reported by quite a few people.
Right.
So,
and then there's the missing tongues, at least on one person.
Well, this was interesting. Excuse me. Yeah, this kept coming up, the missing tongue, and some people were reporting that it was sliced off. And when I found a source that had read the coroner's reports, that is not the case. It was not sliced off, but it was missing. So it was very unusual. When I asked my sister about this, what are these strange things can happen when you find people who have been buried in an avalanche? And she said, one kind of really horrible thing is, the body, it's like quicksand at first, and then it turns to cement. So as that's happening, all sorts of things can happen. Your mouth can be forced open, and people's mouths will be filled with snow. It will be hard packed in there. And so upon finding people, it's possible that their tongue appears missing, that it's back in their
fascinating,
far back in their throat.
Horrific, but fascinating.
It is horrific.
Yeah.
But the coroner, this is different. I mean, so this is someone who's sitting there and, examining the body, and they're saying that it was missing. So that's very different, than finding them and it appears missing. So, but I like to be able to clarify those details. For example, all these people saying that it was cut out, making us think these really horrific, terrible things. It was not cut out.
Well, how about we do come back to this, maybe with some good visuals we can show now that we've got our nice little system. I've got a lot of visuals on other Soviet cases, and we can come back and maybe do this the right way.
Well,
and,
yeah.
and treat it a little bit
I would
more
love that. There
detailed.
are a lot of visuals because this group kept journals and they had multiple cameras. So there are lots of pictures leading up to this.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people have investigated this. I mean, this was 60 years ago. And we have people out there who have taken all the sources and created maps of the area so we can really get a good reading on what the slopes were like. Was it possible that there were avalanches? That's a whole interesting thing I can go into too, because the slope that they were kind of in was less than what you would usually see an avalanche happen in. However, it really depends on the terrain above and how much snow had fallen. And just there's a whole bunch of factors that we really need to see. And I wasn't able to find those yet.
Right.
So
well, we'll come back to it.
There are lots of great pictures and lots of information for us all to assess.
This is in the
this
Ural
case.
Mountains, which is kind of like right in the middle of Russia, if you just take a look at it geographically. And is it the Detlev Pass? What was it?
Yes, it's named after
the lead hiker.
Leader. Yeah, the leader of the group.
Detlev.
Who again was very, excuse me, was very, very experienced. So
Right.
he would have been making, probably excellent judgment calls. So
I would think so.
Yeah. So I hope we can talk about this in detail soon.
I'm glad we did a summary at least.
Yeah.
And this is one of these things, the Soviet Union that's what Russia and its dominions used to be, if you know your history, from 1917 to 1990, the beginning of 92, actually, January 1st. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union, that's what Russia was. And it was a major power, of course. During that period of time, it was run by the Communist Party, and it was very insular. And it became more and more insular, over certain periods of time. Under Stalin in the 30s and 40s and 50s, very, very difficult to get inside what was happening there. But even in the 60s and 70s, it was very, very tough to get information out. Only starting in 1985 with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in March of 1985, a new leadership. I think Gorbachev and those around him realized this system that we have working right now is not working for us. We've got to make some changes. He called those changes perestroika. And glasnost, meaning openness and change. So that was the beginning of the last phase of the Soviet Union, and that series of changes and reforms culminated in a lot of the nations within that empire saying, you know what, change is great. We don't want to be part of this anymore. And the next thing you knew is that by 1989, the Berlin Wall was opened in East Germany, and then the Soviet republics themselves were bolting out. And by the by the end of 91, it was over, and so that was it. But what we have is that during the 80s, a lot of information started coming out to the West, and a lot of that is what I'm going to present here today. And in particular, what you find is that in those last couple of years of the existence of the Soviet Union, 1989, 1990, 1991, was a major upsurge of genuinely perplexing UFO sightings. And the question that I've often asked myself, and I don't have an answer to this, is did that upsurge in sightings happen because simply there was more openness in the society and more people were able to talk about it? Probably a big reason. Or was there something else going on? Was there more interest by these other beings in a nation that was going through political convulsions and ready to rip itself apart? I don't know. But I do want to talk about some of these cases tonight. And I really want to get your commentary on some of them. It's really fascinating. So I just want to point out that the history of Russian UFOs isn't complete by any means, but we do know there's a great deal to explore. And in preparing this program for you, I very quickly realized I could only do a sliver of the full history, but it's a big sliver. So maybe we can come back to more of this in the future, but I think this is going to be quite a bit to digest for you as it is. So without a question, the Russians, or let's just call them the Soviets, since that's the era we're looking at right now, the Soviets had sightings every bit as incredible, every bit as dramatic as we've recorded everywhere else, certainly including the United States. That means sightings in the atmosphere, military encounters, sightings in the water, USOs, that is underwater UFOs, crashes, landing cases, not just crashes, but objects that have landed and then taken off. This is with ground traces that have been analyzed, just like every one of the cases that we've seen in the West. The Soviets, the Russians had them as well. Physical effects on people, including illnesses and even death. All right. Physical effects on plants, physical effects on the ground. You have government files to some extent. I won't really talk a lot about that tonight, but that is definitely part of the picture. And then there's the skeptics in the Russians, in the Soviet Union. There's the believers. There's the government denials. There's government openness. It's all there. And then, as I was saying before, as the Soviet Union cracked apart in the late 1980s, culminating in 1991, sightings went into high gear. And some of the most incredible UFO sightings ever recorded anywhere were recorded during this period. So to give you a flavor, let's just start. I want to start with a well-documented and really terrifying event. In fact, this did prove to be fatal. And I've got a couple of visuals here I'm going to share with you. So this is one of the most dramatic Soviet UFO encounters ever recorded. It happened in the early morning of September 7th, 1984. You're looking at a picture of a commercial Tu-134A. It's a passenger plane. It was a very common passenger plane during the Soviet era. And this this plane was flying. I've got a little map here going north. In fact, it started much south of, this is Minsk in Belarus. So it started south. I can't recall where exactly. It was going up toward the Estonian city of Tallinn. And you can see this is the western part of the old Soviet Union. Here's Europe, right? There's Russia. So while the plane was at Minsk, it was about a little after 4 in the morning. All right. The pilots of this aircraft saw what looked like a large, bright, stretched out star. And it was directing a thin ray of light toward the ground. Now, before long, these are drawings from one of the pilots. Before long, this ray opened up and became like a cone of light. And then another cone of light followed, and then another cone of light followed. They looked at this. They decided this light source was about 80 miles away. The co-pilot drew the sketches that you're looking at here. And the light then turned into what they said was a blinding ray directly at them. And it appeared to explode, and it was then replaced by a greenish cloud. Now, some people out there are thinking, well, maybe this is a military experiment. And indeed, or a launch of a rocket of some sort. And this became the argument of some of the skeptics. But I just want you to hear the rest of this account. So this thing, according to the pilots, moved in some incredible ways. It approached them very rapidly, then stopped dead. Then it descended. Then it ascended vertically. Then it moved left. Then it moved right. And finally, it stopped in front of the aircraft, seemingly pacing them close to their position. So they see multicolored lights within this green cloud, which flares up and it dies away. The cloud changes shape. It gets a tail. It seems to develop a tail, and then it ascends, and the object inside, and then it leaves the cloud in sort of a rectangular shape. Very, very bizarre stuff. The co-pilot is actually shouting. He's like, this thing is teasing us. There is a second Tu-134, second passenger plane about 60 miles away, and it was ordered, because of all of this, it was ordered to approach the position of the first aircraft. Now, you have to understand, like, they're in the air. They should have seen this humongous cloud. They couldn't see it, not until they got right on top of it. Then it became quite visible. And you really have to wonder, what is it that caused it to be invisible until they were just 8 miles?
Yeah.
Is that what's involved with that? So, so then the object turned around. It directed a light at the new aircraft and then downward to trace out what looked like a rectangular shape. And it made zigzag movements, and then it lit the rectangle below, and then it descended and stayed below the aircraft. This is just insane. This is all happening on September 7, 1984. Ground control was listening to all of this, and they told the second plane that the cosmonauts of the Soviet Union that were in space had seen the object from their orbital station. So now by this time, it's 5 in the morning. This is just incredible.
Yeah.
The crew sees running multicolored lights along the side of the object. And that's pretty much it. We don't know how the object departed. I didn't really get that in the encounter, but we do know that there were tragic results from everything that happened. Within a year of this incident, the captain of the second aircraft, his name was Goretz was his last name. His first, I only have his first initial, which was V. It could be Vladimir, it could be Victor, who knows. But he died from what was said to be electromagnetic radiation. That's all I know about that. The pilot of the first plane developed heart disease, lost his job. A stewardess and a steward on the planes developed some kind of bizarre skin disease. All of these people had been hit by the object's rays during the encounter. And not only that, there were ground witnesses to this encounter. So one of them was a colonel. His name was Kovalchuk. He described the object as cigar-shaped, maybe as long as a football field, had a bluish light that he said came straight to the ground. He said it moved sometimes very slowly, as slow as like he thought 40 miles an hour, which there was no aircraft that could do this type of thing. So
we have people on the ground and people at the space station. Did I hear that right?
You did hear that right.
I just wanted to make sure.
And ground witnesses and witnesses in the air.
I mean,
right.
Okay.
So here's where it gets really interesting, like these explanations.
That part was interesting.
So Russian ufologists, no one could agree. It's just like American ufology. No one can agree on anything. They did know that a rocket was launched, from a cosmodrome at a place called Plesetsk. This is a very important Soviet rocket launch facility.
Okay.
That was many hundreds of miles away to the northeast. And the argument was this was what caused the greenish cloud and maybe some of the lighting effects.
Okay.
Now, I just want to show this explanation has still been used to this day. This is what skeptic James Oberg wrote for NBC News a little over 10 years ago. I just want to point out, if you Google this case, and I mean literally use Google search engine on this Soviet case from September 7, 1984, this is the top link you're going to get. And the second link is another skeptical link from the skeptical organization CSI, formerly PSYCOP. So there's nothing new here with what Oberg says. He's really following what the Russians said back in the 1980s, but NBC and Google search engines portray this as this is the answer. No need to go any further. Problem is there are huge problems when you accept this explanation. Could some of this have been caused by a military experiment involving the creation of an artificial cloud? Who knows? We don't have any information to that extent. We have no information giving us that conclusion. But, some people have wondered if this is a genuine UFO incident that just happened with the rocket launch. We do know in American history, rocket launches have often brought in unidentified objects that have kind of inspected the rocket, and there you go. And I've often wondered, like these explanations, it's just a rocket launch. And Oberg's done this a lot. There could be a connection with rocket launches, but it could be someone else was interested in that rocket launch.
Right.
Just possible.
Do you remember when we were standing in the parking lot? I think it was in Roswell. And we saw this incredible green cloud open up that was kind of oddly circular. I mean, it was so incredible to see.
Right.
We were certain it had to be a rocket, based on other ones that we'd seen on the internet before that ended up being what it was, a rocket.
Right.
But it was fantastic, the way the color and in the middle of the black sky, and the design that it was causing. I mean, it was stunning and spooky at the same time. So I always think of this when we talk about rockets launching. I mean, there is, they do produce really unusual effects.
There's no question there can be some very unusual effects caused by experiments, covert rocket launches, or any other types of things going on. And the Russians certainly did have some of that going on. There's no question about it. But here's what I would just say. If you want to glibly explain all of this away as a rocket launch, as Oberg does, as the skeptics do, Russian skeptics, American skeptics, you have to throw out all the pilot's testimony, all right, which in fact Oberg does in his article. He actually does this. He just says, you know, you can't trust their perceptions. We want to trust them, but we can't. You hear this with skeptical all the time.
I mean, we need to trust pilots' perceptions, right?
But skeptics will only say this when the pilots have an observation that disagrees with what the skeptics want. Then they'll say, well, you can't trust their perceptions. So yeah, this is like the basic rule of skeptics. Like when they don't like what the observers see, they just say, well, the observer didn't see what they think they saw.
Right.
Final thing about this case, it's a very interesting case. It was so dramatic. It was seen by so many people that the Soviet censorship on UFOs, which had been very intense up until that point, broke down. And they covered this in the beginning of 1985 just because it was too big a case. It had gotten too much attention. So that's it for that case. It's a fascinating one.
Yeah.
I want to mention a couple of USO cases, just very briefly. These are a little more kind of like rumor mill type stuff, but I think the first one I've got here came to Jacques Vallée when he visited the Soviet Union around I think in the late 80s. This case is from 1977. It's not officially confirmed. I think it's very suggestive. And it was said to have involved a Soviet submarine repair ship. In fact, I've just got a picture of repair ships weren't the same as the submarines. They repaired submarines. And that's one example of a Soviet era repair ship of a submarine. This one was called the Volga. We're talking October 7th, 1977. So we have a date here. It's out at sea. And Vallée got this story when 9 disc-shaped objects circled around this ship for about 20 minutes. During the time, all the electronic equipment went, quote, berserk. There was a captain whose name was Tarantin, and this is what he told his men. I want you to observe this carefully and to remember it. I want you to take pictures and draw it so that when we return to the Soviet Union, no one will be able to say that your captain was drunk or crazy. So that was that case. And that's about all we know about it. That's all I know about it. Now, this is a picture of a Russian researcher, UFO researcher. It's kind of a legend. Pardon me, named Vladimir Azaza. He was a physicist. He was a professor of mathematics at Moscow University. He was probably the leading Soviet UFO researcher for quite a long time. He knew about also many underwater cases. What he said was that Soviet submarines encountered underwater objects frequently. And Azaza was someone who had many, many strong connections, high level within the Soviet military. He was kind of in with the structure of power to some extent. He had a lot of powerful friends, and they would share information with him. Keep in mind, he wasn't publishing major works within the Soviet Union. This is sort of a hush-hush type of topic for most of his career in this. However, unofficially, quietly, he had a lot of military associates who would feed him reports. And he stated there were a lot of these cases of USOs. He said a lot of times Soviets commanders thought that these objects might be American devices, but one incident made it very clear that this could not possibly be the case. There was a Soviet icebreaker at work in the Arctic Ocean somewhere when, according to Azaza, a brilliant spherical craft suddenly broke through the ice and flew up vertically, crashing through the ice and showering the vessel with all of these chunks of ice. Just very dramatic. Sailors are looking up. The officers on deck are looking up, and they see the object, according to Azaza's and his information. And And then they looked down and they saw the hole in the ice. So the thing is, you don't, according to the Zaza, you don't shoot a missile that way. You have to break the ice first. I mean, this can't be a missile.
Right.
And the object was a bright sphere. And it wasn't just shooting off like a missile. And, the sailors there said, look, we know what a nuclear missile looks like. This was not it. So as a result of this, he actually pointed out the Soviet military drew up rules of engagement for UFOs and USOs. And they basically said, how do you observe them? What do you do in a confrontation? Zaza said these UFOs and USOs treated us, or the Soviets, like we would treat a fish or a rabbit. He says it's naive to assume that they have any goodwill toward us or any need to interact. They simply seem to go about their business. They coexist with us. That was his opinion. Very, very interesting stuff. How about a couple of space encounters?
Yeah.
We're just moving along here.
Yeah.
And, the Russians, like the Americans, had a lot of encounters of UFOs in space. I really only want to discuss one major one, and then we'll discuss a second one later. That'll be the Phobos mission to Mars. But this one, we both talked about this one.
Yes.
It's a fascinating one. But this is an early one from 1981. And the Soviets had a space station back in those days called the Salyut. And they had several of them in succession. This was the Salyut 6, May 5th, 1981. They're in orbit. You've got two cosmonauts. Vladimir Kovalyonok seemed to be the main witness, but another witness was his partner, Viktor Savinik. Sure, I'm botching these Russian names, but they were aboard the Salyut 6. They're over southern Africa at this time. Kovalyonok, by the way, there's a really cool picture of these guys. I want to show you what they look like. They're very... They're like got stamps made of them and so forth. Of course, they're cosmonauts. Of course they would. This is Kovalyonok on the left, and this is Savinik here on the right. So Kovalyonok had just finished exercising, and he looks through a portal, and he sees a rotating elliptical object. It's not supposed to be there. It's flying along with the space station. So he couldn't really see how far away it was because they're in space and he didn't really have a good reference point. He calls Viktor Savinik over to look at it. Savinik was about to photograph it. Now, keep in mind, this is like their statement. These are two cosmonauts in space. Could you imagine if American cosmonauts were to make statements like this?
Astronauts,
yeah. So these Soviets made the statement.
It never happens.
So as Savinik was about to photograph it, the object explodes into some golden light. And that was immediately followed by a second explosion, leaving these two very beautiful spheres. And I've got a drawing of this from them. It's not really a good drawing, but
still, if it's from them,
you get the idea.
It's something we want to see.
Right. And Russian writing, it looks like they're, and a residue of white smoke. The space station soon entered Earth's shadow, and they were not able to see the spheres anymore after that. They were very cautious about this, and they're like, mission control, is there anything going on out here? What they learned is that a little later, they learned that Soviet scientists had registered an unusual radiation emission on the day of the sighting. They didn't know that right away. This was covered in the Soviet press, usually without discussing the extraterrestrial connection. And then in 1993, this is after the fall of the Soviet Union, Kovalyonok is now a major general, and he publicly described the event. And these are his words. He said, this is, quote, something impossible according to the laws of physics. And he said it was probably a UFO. He was a major general, cosmonaut, probably a UFO, but it was definitely not mysticism. He says, two people watched it at the same time. I do not believe, he said, when astronauts say they've never seen anything extraordinary in space. So
did you mention, I'm sorry, and I just missed it. Did you mention how long they were watching it? I know you said eventually that it was in shadow. So
I didn't, but I don't think
it seems like it was a long time, right? Just
I don't think it might have even been longer than 5 minutes, to be honest
Okay.
with you. But
but
in
you
a
said
situation-
long enough for one cosmonaut to get the other.
That's right.
Okay.
He's looking at it. It gets a little stranger. So I've never figured out what the actual origin or how confident the source of this is, but I think this happened. This is in the same mission. This is a little bit later, between May 14th and May 18th, sometime in there. Kovalyonok and Savinik reportedly, this is following the docking of the Salyut 6, which they were piloting with another Soviet craft, the Soyuz T-4. This is a major event in space. And this was first described during a little bit later, in a couple of years later, and then by Paul Stonehill, Ukrainian UFO researcher I've known, and a lot of people know who Paul is. So according to this account, the two of them saw an unidentified spherical ship about 30 feet in diameter. It approached them, their position. It occasionally moved erratically, occasionally vanished, and then reappeared. It looked metallic. It had windows. It seemed to be well lit inside. This is a very detailed kind of a sighting, and it's so detailed, you really wonder about this, but I really wanted to include it because it is part of the Soviet UFO lore, and it has a lot of defenders to this day. And this is the crazy part. When they looked at it with binoculars, all right, this got fairly close. They believe almost to within 100 feet. I mean, in space, that's practically being able to touch it. They look inside with binoculars, and they see three brown-colored beings. And I've got drawings of this that were done by artists after the fact. I mean, take a look at this. They had slanted, bright blue eyes, straight noses, bushy eyebrows. They didn't have any emotions, and they seemed to resemble robots in one way or another. According to this account, Soviet mission control would not permit direct contact, so the two crews tried to communicate through hand signals and mathematical equations, maps, Morse code. Didn't seem to get responses from them. And according to the story, at one point, the aliens left their spaceship without protective suits, or at least without seemingly having them.
That's interesting.
What do you make of a story like that? But it's Soviet Union era, came out during the Glasnost era. And is it true? I definitely believe the first one, and the second one. Here's the thing: once you believe that UFOs are real, that kind of rips away a lot of the barriers,
for a lot of everything up,
the things that seem crazy. So now,
healthy skepticism.
You want to. I just wanted to include it because the drawings were kind of neat. And there you go. People can research this one on their own. Now, I'll talk a little bit about crashes and landings, a few, and then we're going to get into some of the really crazy things toward the end of the Soviet Union. But there's a few. A lot of people have heard of Dalnogorsk. I'll get to that in a moment. That's 1986. How you doing there?
Good.
We got some water if you need it.
I'm good. Holding it in.
I think you're doing admirably well.
Thank you. Trying to keep it down there. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who have coughs too. It's the season, right?
There you go. Yeah.
I feel for you.
And they for you.
I'm sure. All the people who have all sorts of things going on.
The Soviets appeared to have recovered crash retrievals of UFOs more than one time. According to Stonehill, who looked into this quite a bit, he believes that there may have been two in the year 1979. One of them apparently was transported to a secret Soviet nuclear facility known as the Tomsk 7. That was a crash in the northern Urals. Another one was in central Siberia. There's not a lot of information we have on this. There's another one, again, not a lot of information, from 1984, said to have occurred July 20th in Azerbaijan. That's in the southern part of the old Soviet Union. And then you have another case from 1984 in the eastern Urals, northwest of a place called Chelyabinsk, in late September or perhaps early October. This is an interesting one. I'll just describe a little bit. You have a local militia captain and a patrolman are driving at around 9 in the evening. They notice odd-colored lights to their right, not far away, about 25 meters. That's about 75 feet. They see a large triangle outlined by multicolored flashing lights in a sequence. The object's either resting on the ground or maybe just above it. They couldn't tell. It's nighttime. The captain later sketched the object. I don't have the sketch, but he had 11 lights on the left and right sides and another 13 going up the center. They stopped their car. They're staring at this thing. At some point, the object just became too dark and impossible to see. They go back the next morning. The next day, the captain goes to the area. He sees 3 round impressions or depressions in the soil, about 10 inches deep, 36 inches in diameter. They took very accurate measurements, apparently. These were the corners of an equilateral triangle. The sides were about 25 feet of the triangle on the ground. There's another interesting landing case that I learned about. This is from 1985. It's quite involved. It involved a radar station in the Krasnovodsk region in Turkmenistan. I have a map of this one. I'll just show you right where it is. This is right on the eastern shore of the Caspian Sea. You'll see it right here. Put a big red dot there. There's a captain named Valuov, registered an unknown object, altitude very high, 60,000 feet. It's quite high. It was huge. They registered it as long as a kilometer.
Wow.
Like a miniature village or town up in the sky. It wasn't moving. It was stationary, but eventually a small object came out of it, had a diameter of maybe 20 feet, flies out of this thing, and it lands at the Krasnovodsk port. All right. They had patrol boats going after this thing, but the object took off. It flew away for about a kilometer. They continued to go after it. And once again, it flew away from them. This was a KGB file in a folder they called the blue folder. Again, blue.
Yeah.
Blue UFO.
Uh-huh.
This happened 5 times, according to the KGB folder. At the end of it, the object just took off with tremendous speed. And
5 times with the
end of
same
it.
object, or 5 different similar cases
No,
in the
5
file?
5 times that it took off
That
and landed.
object. Okay.
The last thing they had is the radar tracking it and seeing it join up with the mother ship, and the object just goes up and away. That's according to this. This is a Soviet era UFO report that is in the KGB files. So now I want to talk about Dalnogorsk. This is sometimes known as the Soviet Roswell. And there's a lot to this case, and we'll talk about it a little bit. Dalnogorsk, as you can see, is in the very, very far east of the Soviet Union. It's not far from Japan. It's not far from northern Manchuria, China. So, and the area of Dalnogorsk, it's a mining town. I don't know how much is going on there, but in 1986, January 29th is when something very amazing happened. And I'll just point out that this event happened less than 18 hours after one of the most famous events of that time happened, and that was the horrible, tragic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. I'm sure there's people watching this who saw that happen live. I remember it, and it was a horrible tragedy. This event happened 18 hours later. I don't think there's any connection here whatsoever. No one's ever tried to make it, but I just thought it was interesting to point that out. So the local time of this event was just before 8 p.m. It was 7:55 p.m., January 29th. So you have local people there seeing like a reddish orange sphere flying at very low altitude, maybe going in the southwest direction, maybe 2,000, 2,500 feet, fairly low, and it's moving level. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And it's absolutely silent. No one hears a thing. And it was very slow moving, like so slow that no aircraft, a helicopter could fly that slow, but no ordinary aircraft could fly this slow. It was maybe 30 miles per hour.
Wow.
Very, very slow. And it was tracked. It wasn't, this is not just eyeballs, but they had a chronometer, which was able to apparently instrumentation to help measure the speed of this thing.
Okay.
So the object approaches a low mountain near the town. and apparently it slows down even further. There were witnesses who said the object rose and lowered itself 6 times, apparently. Each time it rose, the light got brighter. Every time it descended, the light got dimmer. It then dove at a sharp angle. It dropped like a stone, and it burned at the edge of a cliff for an hour. That is
Burned.
That's right, eyewitness testimony. Now, I'm just going to show an image here. This is not a genuine image of the Dolan crash, but you see this frequently in connection to it. The great Soviet Roswell case. This is, as far as I can tell, not a legitimate photograph, obviously. This is pure Photoshoppery, but we've all seen it. I thought, why not just show it? But there's actually a lot that is interesting about this case. So you have a scientific team arriving shortly after, within a week, February 3rd. They get there. The entire area around it was covered in snow, but not at the site.
Okay.
There was no snow at the site. They find physical traces, a large amount of physical traces, weird things, balls of lead and iron, pieces of glass, this kind of fine mesh or netting. There were traces of high temperature activity there, magnetic anomalies. There was damage to trees and stumps in the area. These samples were taken to laboratories. They were taken to several universities, research institutes that studied them, and details of this were published in Soviet newspapers, one called Socialist Industry, of course. And they gave some of the details. They said the so-called lead balls, for example, were actually not truly lead. They were half lead, but they also had a lot of other substances, silicon, aluminum, iron. And there were a lot of other elements found in smaller amounts, zinc, titanium, magnesium, silver, copper, many, many others. And then there are other surprises about these materials, as well as in the crash site itself. And a lot of these scientists were there writing that they were very interested in the mesh. It was like a carbon-based composite, they said, of unknown origin. It was said that the specimen contained quartz filaments 17 microns thick. We're getting into apparent metamaterials here,
Right.
or at least not quite true metamaterials, but very, very tiny manufacturing.
Well, this is something that we saw a little bit when we were on the cruise, that the metamaterials seem to have this very tiny patterned, meshy looking
right
appearance.
We're talking, and I'm going to come back to this in the future. This is the monumental speech by Hal Puthoff at last year's Society of Scientific Exploration. A couple of people have actually written to me and asking me, why haven't you talked about this? Actually, I have talked about it. I have a very long presentation on our Richard Dolan members site, but I'm going to come back with a fairly good treatment of it in the near future. So hang tight. But here at Dolan, we have what appear to be similar types of effects or materials. Now, what's interesting is that they also saw biological effects from these materials. Oh, and I just want to point out there were gold wires inside some of those filaments. So, and then there were biological effects and a reduced count of leukocytes and platelets within the blood of the scientists studying this, and other things as well. So that's interesting. What's really interesting, even such a generally useless site as Wikipedia, and I say useless when you come to the anomalous and the fringe. Wikipedia is usually terrible when it comes to that. But here, Wikipedia offers something that's actually quite interesting. And I just want to point this out. This is the wiki page on the Dolan case. And they write here, the concentration of gold detected in one of the mesh fragments was equivalent to 1,100 grams per metric ton, citation needed. This is much higher than gold deposits in the region, which became economic to extract when the concentration reaches 4 grams per metric ton. In other words, this is a vastly higher concentration of gold. There are no gold deposits in Dolan that contain gold at concentrations high enough to extract. So There you go. Need the citation? You get that with Wikipedia. I would like to get that citation myself, but I just found that very interesting indeed. So anyway, we can move on there. I mean, you have analysts saying it's extraterrestrial, other analysts saying it's some kind of military experiment. A few people said it was from geologic stresses in the earth, and that doesn't seem very realistic to me. I think most...
That would create a mesh. I don't know about that.
Well, people toss out anything. It's like taking, a substance that we shall not name and flinging it onto the wall and whatever sticks.
Right.
So I think that's happened. So this is clearly something manufactured, and, we'll leave it at that. There's a lot going on there. I will just add that Delnogorsk has a lot of UFO reports, not just that crash. And in fact, there were UFO reports in the immediate aftermath of that crash as well. So
it sounds like in terms of the UFO world, their media was far more kind to reporting it.
At a certain point in history, yes.
Okay.
At the end of the Soviet era, there was a kind of openness and restructuring, as Gorbachev called it, that allowed for a shocking level of openness on the matter of UFOs. There's more I want to talk here. There's actually a story of Soviet soldiers seeing a crashed, captured disc. I'll pass it. Maybe we'll come back to that another time.
Part two.
I want to talk about when things really get crazy. This is the strange Soviet year of 1989. We're going to talk about Phobos now. So now, in late 1988, actually in the middle of 88, the Soviet Union, in conjunction with the United States, in conjunction with European nations and so forth, sent out 2 probes to Mars. All right, Phobos 1 and Phobos 2. Phobos is the name of one of Mars's little moons, or moonlets. They're basically just these little irregular rocks.
They're little potato-looking.
That's exactly
moons.
it. So one is Phobos, one is Deimos. Each probe was very complicated. It had a lot of television cameras and something called a spectrometer, had a guidance system, video recording system. So these are sent off in July. Phobos 1 had a software error very, very early on, and they had to shut it down in September of 88. Phobos 2 had problems as well, but it kept going. By the end of 1988, they said it was running hot. Many of the instruments were. It had lost 2 of the 3 television channels. It was using a backup transmitter, but it made it to Mars orbit on January 29th, 1989. So it goes in orbit, and I'm going to show you a picture. Some very, very interesting pictures here. This is an image from Phobos 2, and that's an image of Phobos, and there's Mars, of course, in the background. So it begins taking images of what it sees or what's in front of it. One of its main missions, by the way, was to direct a laser ray at the surface of Phobos, the moon, okay, to cause a small explosion, and it was going to gather data from the evaporated substances. So kind of a neat idea for an experiment. Then there were more problems that happened when Phobos 2 got in alignment with Phobos, the moon. Middle of March 1989, the probe takes video images of the Martian surface. And while this is some very bizarre stuff, I'm going to just show this to you. Oh, well, this is a picture of Phobos. That's kind of a neat, that's the potato in Mars's orbit. And then it takes this. So this is near the Martian equator, and you see a network of these straight lines and all these geometric relationships. You have some lines that are short, some lines that are long, some are thin. Others look like rectangular shapes, and here's a close-up. This covers an area of about 600 square kilometers. That's more than 230 square miles. A huge area. So it's broadcasting this to Soviet television, and while it's doing that, it sees something else. That's very, very, very interesting. Here's another just fascinating images here. It sees this. So this is some kind of shadow. You can see surface features of the planet at the lighter portions of the ends of the shadow. Now, this is very different from the shadow that would have been cast by either the probe itself or by Phobos, the moon. According to what I learned, this is a shadow that stretches 300 kilometers across the surface of Mars, about 200 miles. Then, on March 25th, so this is nothing else is transmitted for a couple of weeks. The probe takes its last photograph of, and there it is, of what appears to be a large and long cylindrical type object very close to Phobos. Here's Phobos, and here's the object, and you can see there's a little bit of black space at the bottom of that right there. All right. This object would have been about 2 kilometers wide and about 20 kilometers long. That's the belief now.
Wow.
And
It's huge.
Brightness was the same as that of the moonlet, as you can see. Its sides were parallel. Both of the ends are rounded. The end toward Phobos, if you get a good image of it, narrows just a little bit slightly, and then the other end seems to have a little bit of a protrusion. This is the last image ever captured by the probe. 2 days later, Phobos 2 failed to reestablish communications with Earth. They commanded it to reposition itself for an imaging session. It didn't do that. Instead, it went into a spin. Next day, Soviet Mission Control Center announces they've lost communication. And they're very puzzled by this, and no one really knows what to make of it. It's very awkward. 2 years later, this is Colonel Dr. Marina Popovich. She herself is a legend in the Soviet Union. She was a cosmonaut. She was a pilot, an amazing pilot. And she reveals this picture. This picture had not been revealed until she revealed it at a press conference. And she argued, it was called the PMO image, the Phobos, what does that stand for? The Phobos mystery object. And she said, it's anomalous. We don't know what it is. So that's Marina Popovich. There's more to say about this, but I want to keep moving because I want to talk about Kapustin Yar, and we need to really talk about the great event of March 1990. But what do you think about the Phobos incident?
20 kilometers long, 2 kilometers wide.
Yeah. If the estimates of the object are what they thought in terms of the distance from the camera and so forth, but it would be massive.
Yeah, one of these things doesn't doesn't look like any sort of natural formation. So,
but no matter what we can say about it, this cylindrical, this long, narrow thing, no one knows how to identify it.
Right.
And it was the last thing, imaged by the Phobos 2 crash. It's incredible. So Kapustin Yar is a major Russian and Soviet rocket launch facility. It's in the western part of the Soviet Union. Let me just show you on a map. This is like their Area 51. It's their White Sands missile range. There it is right there. And it has a long, long history of UFO encounters. I'm going to skip all of the early encounters. I want to go right to July 28th to the 29th, 1989. It's, I think, the most dramatic and best known of the encounters. So we have this file from the breakup of the Soviet Union. The file is obviously incomplete, but there's a lot of information here that shows something fascinating happened. So near midnight, a disc-shaped object flew silently toward this facility. There's a rocket weapons depot there. It flew right toward that, flashing an intensely bright light from the underside. There's a drawing here that I'm just going to show you. It's some artist rendition. The object hovers above the weapon site, very low, 60, 70 feet, 20 meters. It's described as about 13 to 17 feet in diameter. Its hull was lit with a kind of dim green phosphorus-like color. A bright beam comes from beneath it. You can see that's, shown in the artist rendition here. And it circles around 2 or 3 times. It moves toward a railway station, still flashing its lights. Then it comes back to the weapons depot, very low over. According to the documents we have, there were orders made to scramble a fighter jet to intercept this thing, but the pilot couldn't see it in detail because the UFO, this is a quote from the document, the UFO did not let the aircraft come near it, evading it. Atmospheric conditions were suitable for visual observations. That's according to the Soviet document. So this object remained visible in the area for more than an hour. You're getting to 1:30 in the morning. It then flies off toward a town and called Aktubinsk and disappears. There's testimony from 7 Soviet soldiers and officers. They're all in agreement with each other. 3 of them who had a good position apparently said this thing performed amazing acrobatics.
Wow.
And at one point they said it divided into 3 shining points and took the shape of a triangle. One of the witnesses is a soldier. He says that no aircraft could fly like this, and he said it accelerated. This is another witness who said accelerated abruptly and also stopped abruptly, all the while doing large jumps up and down. There's more to be said about this, but we're missing some documentation as well. But you can see, sounds like a lot of American cases we've described.
Right.
What would one say if, to the explanation that, well, we're looking at serious, black technology, secret technology. You hear this with the Americans. Is this Soviet black technology that they don't know about? Is this American black technology that just goes into Soviet airspace and is playing games over there? Seems a little odd to me.
Yeah.
So
these are really interesting accounts. I mean, a lot of them are multiple witness, military witness,
right.
Different vantage points.
Absolutely.
These are really good cases.
Now, this is another one I want to talk about that you were studying, the Voronezh case. Were you looking at this earlier
I was
today?
briefly looking at
briefly. So it's an incredible case, and Voronezh is a city. It's got nearly 1 million people. It's big. It's I think I've got a map of it here. Let me show you where.
This one is interesting, though. I did make some notes on this one.
Here's where Voronezh is, right there in the western part of the Soviet Union. And it's interesting because these are some of the witnesses they're interviewed. On YouTube, there are some pretty interesting coverages and documentaries about this. I just want to point out that during 1989, there were so many UFO cases going on in the Soviet Union. They were just nonstop. Many were incredible, but all of them were overshadowed by the case in Voronezh. So, and it wasn't just one incident. All right, we're talking about 2.5 weeks from late September to early October. You have a heavy UFO concentration there, and it included multiple landings. It included 3 different kinds of entities being reported.
Right.
They're very sensational.
There were actually thousands of reports during that time of sightings and landings and beings. Thousands during those couple of weeks.
Yeah, it was like off the hook, as they say. And I mean, clearly they seem sensational, but when you get that many sensational things happening, you got to wonder what the truth is.
Right. The details of this case are pretty interesting.
Yeah,
so I'm not going to say anything till you describe it.
There was a case. There were several. There was one on September 21. There was one on September 24th. The one on September 21, you've got several boys saying that there were 2 humanoid beings and a robot-like entity there. Coming from a landed sphere. On the 24th, you have an engineer who said he saw a maneuvering object that looked like an airship of some sort. But it's the event on the 27th of September that really got attention around the world. It was covered by everyone. The Soviet news agency TASS covered it. And that's kind of important because that had the stamp of official approval, basically. Western media covered it. So according to what TASS reported during the early evening of the 27th, 1989, You got a lot of school children playing in a park and many adults, maybe 40 adults, supervising them. 6:30 in the evening, people notice a light in the sky. It's pink or red. It becomes a dark red sphere, and it circles 40 feet above the ground, and then it flies away. Then it comes back a few minutes later, and it's hovering. While it's in the air over the park, a hatch opens up, and this enormous being appears. He's 10 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
It's wearing what look like silver coveralls and a bronze-colored boots, and they said it had 3 eyes, or maybe 2 eyes and something else that looked like an eye.
Mm-hmm. 3 holes, like 3.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's looking at the terrain, and it closes the hatch. So it's like a little, let's check this out.
Mm-hmm.
The sphere comes lower, brushes up against a tree, and lands. I'm very interested in all the details that come out in this.
Yes.
And I think you notice this as well. The witnesses, adults and kids, all gave a great amount of detail, just like this when they talked about it.
And it was consistent among different reports of this being in particular. I just want to mention the description of the head too. It was this kind of flat, smooth, but not a sort of a normal shape. It was sort of a
As the craft landed, a being comes back out again, and this is what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like and it has a robot of some sort with it, right?
Right.
It says something, no one can make it out, and then this rectangle appears on the ground. It's luminous. It says something else. The rectangle disappears. It adjusts something on the robot's chest. The robot's walking in a mechanical way. It's like the day the earth stood still.
I know. That's what I thought of too. Yeah.
One of the boys cries out. Let me show you some of the pictures that we have here. One of the boys cries out. He says, I think I'm terrified of this thing. The alien looks at it. And when it did so, the boy becomes frozen. He can't move. People start to shout. And then the sphere and the beings vanish on the spot. 5 minutes later, the sphere comes back. The being reappears. And this time, the being has a tube, a long tube, 4 feet long, points it at the boy. And in front of this crowd, according to the story, the boy disappears.
That's right.
And then the boy reappears when the alien enters the sphere and flies off.
Mm-hmm.
They fly off, and then the boy's back.
There were other accounts of the sphere paralyzing people.
Yeah, this is another. Yes, right.
Which is really important for people who really look into abductions, and for people that we've spoken to who have really serious cases.
Mm-hmm.
Lifetime cases. There are reports of this sort of, not wand, I don't know what to call it, like a tube or a wand, that seems to be able to do things to people, like paralyze them. So it's an important piece.
Right. I'm just showing some of their artist renderings of the beings that people said they saw over time. I mean, this is a kind of bizarre looking thing right here, but whatever. This is kind of closer to the being of the September 27th incident, I think.
You can see what we're saying about the head. It has this sort of
very, very
unusual
bizarre
shape. Yeah.
Point is, look, a lot of Russian ufologists looked into the case, and as crazy as these things sound, there was a man named Genrik Silanov. He was head of the Voronezh Committee for the Study of Anomalous Phenomena. He's got a group. They're out speaking to witnesses. He was absolutely convinced. He said, look, the media exaggerated a lot. They took what he called creative license with the reports. But he says something extraordinary does seem to have happened. He interviewed many of the witnesses. They were very, very corroborative with each other. And they were high caliber people, by the way, local militia, police lieutenants, economists, engineers, professionals. So, the American media took all of this and said, kids at a park got nothing better to do than to make up fantasies. And that's basically the American media just.
But it's far more complicated than that.
No,
and again,
really
like
is.
I said before, thousands of reports within a couple of weeks, and a lot of them were sort of the same time of day. that
Yeah.
that that these unusual sightings of these massive spheres
I'm glad you looked at
occurred.
it. I didn't actually know there were thousands. I knew there were lots.
Yeah,
Thousands, just is
thousands.
mind-blowing.
Mhm.
So there was obviously a major, huge, intense wave that was
Right.
going on there.
Now, what about there were reports of legs actually coming out of the sphere to hold it up on the ground. Had you heard that as well?
Yeah, I heard this, and it's probably totally possible. I mean, you've got different witnesses seeing different things, though, right?
Right, you do. But I believe there was an investigation where they looked into the imprints on the ground, and they could
And notice ground traces.
Well, they could, excuse me, not only ground traces, but they could tell by how deep the imprint was that what it was, the weight that was on top, they were estimating around 11 tons, I believe.
Fascinating.
I think, I don't know this for sure. We'd have to look into this, but I thought Jacques Vallée was involved with. I'm not positive.
Vallée did go and look into this. Absolutely, he
okay.
did. Yeah,
because you tell me he's often involved in cases in terms of what happened with the environment. He's very, very interested and detailed as far as the ground and the environment.
Yeah, Vallée definitely has talked about a particular interest, because these are cases where you can apply some science, right? You can study the ground traces, and he's looked into many. He did look into Voronezh as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, I just thought that's a really important thing, because, I mean, you look at these pictures and, they're hard to believe, but excuse me, giant spheres with legs coming out of them, but then you have some actual physical trace evidence on top of people's reports.
A lot of the Western media and Western analysts would just say, look, this is Soviet propaganda. And a lot of these Soviet UFO reports were just passed off as Russian attempts to fool Americans into thinking these are UFOs, when in fact they're testing their own technology. And this is a very popular explanation. But again, these explanations only fly, so to speak, if you ignore like 90% of the witness testimony.
Right.
So let's talk about the last event that we're going to get into tonight. And it's one of my favorite UFO encounters to discuss from any region of the world. This is it's a major Soviet sighting, takes place March 21st, 1990, a bit east of Moscow. I'm going to show it to you on a map. It's known as the Peroslavl region. Here we go. Let's just go right to it. And so it's east of Moscow. You can see there's Moscow right there. It's kind of northeast of it. And March 21st, 1990, that night between 8 p.m. and midnight, about 4 hours, you have objects, multiple objects seen over a very wide area, not just where the little red dot is. It's generally a little larger on this area, encompassing Peroslavl, Zalesky, and many other regions in Russia. So you have radar stations placed on, radar stations tracking this, aircraft placed on alert, residents phoning the authorities. They're describing flashes of white light following one another after 2 or 3 seconds. No one was able to describe this thing easily. It was elusive. In one area, the object was said to hover very low, lighting up the ground below it. There's members of a watch post in Zalesky saying they saw an object with red lights approach from the west about 9:15 in the evening, much faster than any plane, they said. 15 minutes later, the object disappeared, but it was followed by a similar object with white lights. And that would be, then they would lose track of it. 2 Soviet interceptors that we know of were dispatched that night. One of them was scrambled at 9:38 p.m. We've got all the information on it. Flown by a pilot named Colonel Semyonchenko. I want to make sure I say that name correctly. And at that time, he's going after it. He was above Peroslavl region. He's about 2,000 meters, 6,000 feet. A little after 10 in the evening, he sees the 2 white flashing lights of the target right ahead of him, just to the right. And he's tracking it on his aircraft radar. And he's able to distinguish it from nearby commercial traffic. So he's on the radio, and he orders the target to identify itself. It doesn't do that. Instead, it just changes its speed and its altitude. So it's basically evasive. He then turns very steeply, and he's noticing something like the aurora borealis in the north and northwest. He's coming back to the UFO. He's passing above it, just 500 or 600 meters away from it, incredibly close in the air for a fighter jet. He sees the two flashing white lights, and he briefly sees the silhouette of the object itself against the background of the city. He says it was difficult to determine its nature or classification. Those are his exact words.
Okay.
He says, due to the limited lighting, but he did see it, he said. So then he has to come back to the airfield. By the way, I want to show the CIA. The CIA was tracking it. Here you go. And let me share this. This is a CIA document. Actually, from the foreign, it was actually foreign news clippings connected by the CIA. So I remembered reading this case when I was studying this for Volume 2 of UFOs and National Security State. So when Semenchenko approaches this, he says it was disappear. And this was a statement of the people on the ground who were observing it. They said, you're coming up to it, it goes away. They said the unknown object would turn and approach the jet at a very high speed, and then it would disappear, only to reappear behind and above his jet. It played cat and mouse games, basically, for a while, and that was it. So there were a bunch of witnesses that the Soviet military was able to interview. These are Soviet military people. They got a very good view of the object. One of them was a captain named Birin. He said the object looked like a flying saucer with two very bright lights along the edges. Pretty straightforward. He thought it was fairly large, maybe 300 feet, maybe up to 500-600 feet, rather large. And he said he saw what looked like a portal. He saw, he said he noticed, and this reminds me of the Dolan case.
A portal or a porthole?
A porthole.
Okay.
A porthole. Sorry, yeah. I wasn't very clear. Remember in the Dolan case, the people noticed that when the object would raise altitude, it would get brighter. When it lowered, it would get dimmer. This witness noticed that when the object picked up speed, that the lights would flash faster. And when the object slowed down, the lights would flash more slowly. It was rather interesting. And then when he said when it hovered, the lights went out almost altogether. So I thought that was interesting. There were more statements of this. One of the things that comes out is the object was able to do an S-turn in flight. There are military witnesses who said this and so forth. What is interesting to me about this case, in addition to just the intrinsic fascination of it, are the statements from two important people in the Soviet Union.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The coughing.
I'm like, this is such a good part. Okay.
One was the Deputy Minister of Defense. I believe he later became Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union. His name was Ivan Tretyak. He talked about this. I have a picture of Tretyak here. Let me just show you. He's, you know, one of these classic Soviet generals with all the medals on. And he talked about this. He wouldn't say what it was. He wouldn't speculate what it was. But he did say the pilots would not attack it because they thought it might have had we called it a formidable capacity for retaliation. Later, in an interview he gave like a year or more later, he said a little bit more. He was willing to discuss this, and he said that, yes, our fighters encountered UFOs in Soviet airspace. He called it an unidentified flying machine. He said it was photographed by the pilots. That's interesting because we've never seen photographs of this.
Wow.
He said it gave off optical signals and thermal signals, so a heat signature. And he said, although it had some kind of stealth-like capacity that blocked airborne radar. It was definitely not an airplane, he said. Definitely not an airplane. Okay.
Okay.
But then here's what he wouldn't do. He wouldn't go the full way and say, well, it looks like a UFO, because He says, look, most of these things are explainable, natural phenomena, rocket launches, satellites, conventional events. This is what he's saying. Now, okay,
CYA, right?
CYA indeed. I mean, you're talking about this thing as an unidentified flying machine, but then he's saying, well, a lot of these are passed off as natural phenomena. Is he saying that that object was a natural phenomena? I don't think so. How could he possibly? There's really no explanation for it. He just basically blows off the journalist, and that's the end of it. Now, there's one other person who I think was much more straightforward, and that was a general named Igor Maltsev. And there's a picture. I've got two pictures of Maltsev. One is actually with George Knapp, who was also visiting the Soviet Union. If I can just get this to, there we go. This is George Knapp right here, and Igor Maltsev there. This is in 1990, I believe, so the year of the event, possibly 91. George would know. Maltsev talked about this at the time. His position was Chief of Soviet Air Defense Forces. He was very, very powerful and very important. He really had a lot to say about this. He said several radar stations. Here's Maltsev again. Whoops, that's Gorby. Come on now. There we go. Nope. Can't really seem to get the one picture of Maltsev. What is wrong here? Come on now, people. There we go. There's Igor Maltsev. He said that we had over 100 visual observations made by military personnel. 2 photographs of the UFO were taken. So Trepyak and Maltsev both confirm there were photographs taken. We don't have those photographs. He says, based on all the data, this object was a disc. He says it was about 100 to 200 meters in diameter. That's very consistent with the witness testimony. He's probably working off of that. He says he confirmed it was able to perform an S-turn flight horizontally and vertically, as well as to hover and to fly. He said with a speed exceeding that of the modern jet fighter by 2 or 3 times. So 2 or 3 times faster than a jet. He said all the while it was silent while it did these things. And he said, look, this is my favorite part of what he says. He says, these objects were completely devoid of inertia. He said, whoever was operating them, they had somehow come to terms with gravity. Someone said, well, would you speculate on what this object is? He says, nope, I'm not going to speculate. He says, however, this is another favorite quote. At the present time, terrestrial machines could hardly have any such capability. So,
wow.
This was reported at the time. Yeah, in the Soviet Union. It was reported that image I showed you before you saw my actual my written notes on it, but was a document from the CIA's Foreign Broadcast Information Service, that's FBIS. And this was written up by the MUFON Journal. It was written up by the International UFO Report. It really came out. So that was that case. And again, what was that thing?
Very significant. Yeah.
What was that thing? The only other thing I just want to say about the Soviets is I have a picture of Gorbachev here. Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, the leader who presided over the end of the Soviet Union. I think to this day, he's probably loved or hated by people. But, you know, I remember at the time really being fascinated by Gorbachev, and he was definitely a very, very monumental historical figure. But one thing about him, I think this is in 1990, and that's not a picture of Gorby in the situation I'm about to talk about, but this is him in a public situation where he is visiting, I think he was in Ural, the Ural area in the city of Sverdlovsk in April 26, 1990. And he was asked, does the the Soviet Union study UFOs? And on this occasion, he's a little hedgy. He just says, well, I know that there are scientific organizations which study this problem. But he was reported to have made a much more direct statement on May 4th, 1990. There's a newspaper in Riga which contained a full-page article which said that during his meeting with the Ural workers, this is the same meeting, Gorbachev said, quote, "The UFO phenomenon is real and we should approach it seriously and study it." So that was from his meeting with a workers' a plant in the Ural Mountains. And there you go. That's Gorby. So that's a little bit about the UFO phenomenon in Soviet Union.
Yeah.
That was like
I love it.
racing through.
Well, I know, and I know there's so much more, and we're going to get into some of those other cases because we're going to do part 2. But
we will, yeah.
It is really fascinating to sort of move around the world and hear what's been going on, because we don't really do that enough.
No.
You know, we're so focused on North America. So I kind of really love that we're either interviewing researchers or we are, making our way around. And by the way, we do have plans to interview Paul. And
Paul Stonehill.
Yeah, we've talked to him. It just wasn't a good time, but we will eventually do that.
Yeah, I think he would give a very good interview on Russian and Soviet era UFOs. He's written a number of books on the subject. He certainly knows it quite well. So this was a lot for me to put together. I've done most of this in the past. A lot of my notes from particularly volume 2 of UFOs in the National Security State. I went back through some of those old notes and tried to pull those up. And there was a lot of new information as well that I didn't know in researching this to put this together. And doing it took pretty much all day. I lost out on my gardening today. It was one of the nice
He wanted to get outside. We had a sunny day. We couldn't believe it.
Yeah,
he wanted to get outside, but we were both so deep into what we were looking at.
Yeah.
We didn't make it outside.
But honestly, I enjoyed doing this. I enjoyed
exactly.
Going back over this. And
exactly.
We have this kind of tunnel vision with our own little situation in our own society and our own time period. And we forget other nations, other important nations have had this, and it's a big part of their history too.
Yeah. And I mean, look at those cases are so fascinating.
What you find, American skeptics, particularly Western skeptics, love to smack down the Soviet UFO cases, but I really think that they do a disservice. I think they're very unfair. The case from 1984 that, for example, Oberg talked about, and he did a lot of Soviet cases. He tried to debunk pretty much all of the Soviet UFO cases in the 1980s and beyond. And it's not that you shouldn't look at these with a skeptical mind, and it's not that you don't want to look at the prevalence of rocket launches and the like, but you've got to look at the evidence that people are presenting you. You've got to look at what witnesses are saying. And yes, it's true. Like, all right, our eyes can deceive us. It's possible, but not when it's something so dramatic and crystal clear by so many witnesses. At some point,
and for some of them, it's very close to them.
Yeah.
Right. And again, different perspectives that we had. There were some people on the ground, some people in the air, and some people above. We
have eyes for a reason. Otherwise, like these skeptics just like remove their eyes and pretend they're useless. That's really what they do when they get a case that doesn't accord with what they believe and that seems to describe what they think is impossible.
Right.
It's the problem. Like if you go at this subject with the opinion that all of this is impossible, then you must have these types of explanations, right? Like there's no other alternative.
And you're also saying that all of these very credible witnesses are lying, including military.
Lying or totally delusional or drunk or on drugs or whatever.
That many people in the military lying on drugs and delusional?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
I don't buy that.
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And then you have the statements of Tretyak and Maltsev from the 1990 incident, which is... Yeah, I mean, to me, that's slam dunk territory. And Maltsev was interviewed by lots of individuals. And the other thing that makes me say this is not like a Soviet op against the Americans is you've got Tretyak and Maltsev each having very different perspectives on the event. They're both describing it as totally anomalous. Maltsev is a bit more open about it than Tretyak was, but they both talked about it. They were both very prominent people in the Soviet government and military at the time.
Right.
So it's amazing.
So very significant. So are we going to do part 2?
Yeah, I think there's more than enough. When I was going through what I have already put together over the years, I had like way more. And so what I wanted to do was put in the real heart of what I've always considered the most dramatic Soviet cases. But the fact is, there's more.
Of course.
There is the
of course.
Dietmar Pass incident that we talked about earlier. There's more to
Yes.
kind of unpack there. And there were a number of aviation cases and nuclear cases. Not all of the Soviet cases are, super well documented. That's the problem. UFOs for most of the period of the Soviet Union were not a proper thing to talk about. It's not that you would go to prison, but it would really damage your career. There was an intense, stigma attached to it, and it was absolutely not acceptable for many, many years. So researchers had to kind of do this on, quietly, like Azaza,
Right.
Vladimir Azaza.
Right.
And so, so when you get a story, it's the case of someone not having an official document, but a story coming to a researcher like Vladimir Zaza. And so you've got to take it for what it's worth. But I think, in that situation, we should take those stories and consider them. And there's quite a few of them.
I wonder if there are any reporting agencies. I'm sure there are, just like here.
Yeah, there's some Russian-based UFO organizations. And some of them will put out journals, and they have information, and some of it is translated into English as well. So there is information. And I think it would be a good idea for us to revisit this and come back with some more information.
We're having anomalous experiences all over the globe.
Yeah.
Something that unites us, really. Something much bigger than all of our political divisions.
Now, I do want to come back in the future to, we were talking with Dolan, this almost kind of quasi-metamaterial type stuff that was being analyzed. And the fact is, that is a very big issue today.
Yeah.
And it's definitely my opinion that the statements that have come out, and I'm talking predominantly about Hal Puthoff's speech last June 2018 at the Society of Scientific Exploration meeting, where he talked explicitly about his role in studying UFOs over the years, his role with the ATIP contract as a subcontractor to Robert Bigelow's organization, his role in requisitioning or putting out the contract for 38 scientific papers that have just the titles of which are declassified, and the study that he and Dr. Eric Davis have undertaken of this artifact that is unbelievably interesting and complex. This is a kind of scientific disclosure, and it's shameful, but almost typical that the scientific community seems to be ignoring this, but they're not going to ignore it forever. This is too important. So I want to come back. I really want to unpack that. I talked about this a couple of months ago on Coast to Coast, actually, with George Norrie.
Didn't you talk about it on Jimmy Church a little bit as well?
Yes, I talked about this with Jimmy Church as well. That's right. And I talked about this on Richard Dolan Members.
And on the cruise.
So, and on our recent cruise. So yeah, this has been definitely an interest of mine, but I want to do this again and talk about it maybe on Intelligent Disclosure at some point in the near future. I think we really need to be having a broader conversation about this. And, one of the other things I just want to say about the folks associated with TTSA, guys like Luis Elizondo and Hal Puthoff himself and Jim Semivan and the rest. The only one I know personally is Puthoff, but you get the statements of all of them, and it's very interesting. Those people who want to just come out with all of their cynicism and say this is all an op, dismiss it. You're missing something. There's something important here, and you need to just pay attention. Prick up your ears and pay attention to what they're saying. All right. I mean this. And what we're seeing is a kind of limited and very controlled disclosure. It's not 100% honest. All right. But that doesn't mean you should be just dismissing it all. There's important information in here.
What did you just say? Did you just say it's not 100% honest?
It's not 100% honest.
Oh, that's what you said.
Here's why it's not 100%. It's not 100% honest, because all of these statements are as if, oh, well, we've just learned about this UFO phenomenon. You know, we had our Tic Tac UFO experience in 2004. And what was this? We need to look into it. Look, the UFO phenomenon has been very, very critically important since the 1940s, explicitly to U.S. national security. This is not a new thing.
Right.
You know, and they're talking like, well, we don't know what it is. Well, keep in mind, I understand why they're doing this.
Of course.
They've got to. They're having a public conversation.
Right.
But I'm going to say right now, they know damn well what this is. They're just not saying it. So there's a bit of holding back, you know, the actual truth about what's going on here. But they're doing this in order to broach this subject to the public. But
well, yeah, that makes absolute sense. It's a big leap to go and say it's UFOs, but they can look at the evidence that they have and focus there and say that it's, you know, it's nothing that we have. So I think that's, if it's the skeptics that they're talking to, that's an intelligent way to do it.
Yeah.
You know,
but we'll come back to this.
a sophisticated way to do it. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to open this up right now, get you thinking about it. I want to come back to this and really explore this. Again, it's not to say, like, because I've thought and talked about disclosure for a long time. And I've always maintained that when it happens, it's not going to be honest. It's not going to be 100%. Yeah. And indeed, this is, I think, what we're seeing. We're seeing an attempt to rebrand UFOs as something a little bit different. UAP actually is how they're rebranding it. And I think they're being a little more successful than I would have thought, actually. But I'll come back to all of that. It's fascinating stuff. For tonight, it was the Soviets.
That's right.
The Russians.
We didn't get to do that case. And by the way, I just want to say the Dyatlov case that we were talking about in the beginning of the show with the 9 skier hikers. That case has been reopened after 60 years.
Oh, right. So I'm glad you mentioned
that's one of the reasons why it's significant right now. It was reopened in February. And apparently they are going to the site to open up the investigation again.
I wonder, though, like, what can they learn?
I don't
the real question.
know. I really don't know. You know, I really studied the case and all of the different elements and the unusual anomalies. And, you know, I really went into that. But as far as what they can get now, I really don't know.
Well, I'd like to know what they can learn. Maybe are they talking about going into old archives and seeing what the old Soviet documents might have to say about it?
Apparently there is so much information. But no, what I read was saying they're actually going back to the site. And again,
someone's writing, there's a new book about it. At least that's what I'm just seeing right there. So wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, it's an interesting case.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible that it didn't have anything to do with UFOs. You know, there were lights in the sky reported by multiple witnesses, including military, excuse me. But there are other potential explanations. So it's a fascinating case to go through piece by piece by piece.
So this is what we're going to do. We're going to wrap you up, young lady.
Okay, I'm not going to go into
hot tea.
So interesting.
Some vapor, whatever, to open you up and let you relax a little bit. You all understand. Look at Tracy's running on fumes here.
I'm hanging on. I'm hanging on.
Well, I hope that was interesting for you. I want to thank everyone for coming out. We want to thank you for coming out. If you like what you see, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe button's right there. Helps us out very much. Look, here's the thing. I really want this channel to get as many subscribers as possible. Why? It's not for me. This is for the UFO phenomenon, so we get some mainstream coverage and some mainstream weight here. We need to be having conversations with a larger community around us. And the fact is, no one's really going to care about anyone, no matter how interesting they are, if they don't have any followers. That's basically the currency in today's social media. So if you like the video, that's great. If you subscribe to the channel, that's great. And that really helps us out. So please. And then, of course, get notifications so you never miss when we have a new program, which comes out several times a week. That's right. And you also know when we go live. So on Saturdays, Richard goes live at, random times. So if you have notifications turned on, you will be notified at that time. I like to
And-
keep people guessing. So there you go.
Yeah, that's just because it's a Saturday and we don't know what we're going to be doing.
It's because I don't get my act together in time, and I just never know what time Saturday will happen. But it does happen almost every Saturday.
Okay, so I just want to ask something really quickly. So Project Blue Book, you have one left to do of explaining the
Right.
real cases, right?
I'm going to talk about the Washington sightings of 1952. That was episode 10 of the History Channel's Project Blue Book series. I've covered all the others, and I'm not covering the TV episodes. I'm covering the actual events.
Right.
And I'm trying to give the last one I did was the Betty and Barney Hill case. I did that nearly for an hour.
I know.
It was way longer than I had planned, but I really wanted to unpack that
It's a
case.
good case, and I'll just tell you from being in the chat, it was confusing for a lot of people because it was almost unrecognizable as the Betty and Barney Hill case.
You talk about the History Channel.
The History
presentation of
Channel's
it.
version of it. I mean, people were surprised even that was it. You know, it was so different.
Yeah, they took a lot of liberties with it, just to be sure. Now, one thing that was true, though, I mean, they really took it to an extreme, was the stress on Barney, which was portrayed in the show, of course, to an extreme. But Barney really was
It didn't
deeply,
happen like on the show.
No,
at
absolutely,
all.
totally different.
It wasn't shot at.
Keep in mind, look, the whole thing with that series, I've said it, we've said it many times. They're fictionalizing, dramatizing. It's not a documentary.
Okay.
So got to get over that.
And can I just say this, because people were asking in the chat last Saturday, why you think they might have taken the liberty. I mean, since that we know they were a mixed race couple, an interracial couple, why do you think they portrayed them as not? Yeah.
And so just to be clear, in real life, Betty and Barney Hill were an interracial couple, a mixed race couple, who in 1961 had an extraordinary experience with which appeared to be an alien abduction. When the Blue Book series treated that episode, they moved it from 1961 to 1952. And the reason they did that was because, well, they wanted to have all of their best cases in season 1. They didn't know if they were going to get picked up
so
for
they
second
could get
season.
picked up for season 2. They
So
mushed it all together into a smaller time frame.
So I never asked them this question. I don't actually know the answer, but why they decided to make Betty and Barney Hill both African American,
right,
instead of African American and Caucasian. I don't know why they did that, but my only
you had an interesting
only guess is that maybe they thought in 1952 it was a little bit less plausible, as opposed to 1961. You've had a lot of the civil rights movement has begun. 1952 is pre Rosa Parks even, so it's kind of early on, and maybe they just didn't think it would fly. I don't know, but I really have no idea.
I know
They should not have changed it, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
It was a big mistake.
Absolutely. It was the first thing when we had seen it ahead of time, and History Channel came to film Richard in the House about the true cases. It was the first thing we were like, why did they do that? You know, but they weren't the ones who had the answer. They weren't the writers. So, but yeah, we were all over them about that immediately.
Still don't know.
Still don't know.
If we ever get an opportunity, I would definitely like to ask, but as of now, I don't know why they made that very perplexing decision, I must say.
They did.
Oh, well.
So let's just take this opportunity to thank everyone who is here. You guys are over here. We can sort of see it rolling. And in the corner of my eye, I saw some colors and just tons of people. So we just want to thank you all for being here. It means so much to us. Your support, our chat family, all the people who watch it after, your comments, just being here means so much. We thank you. And we saw that there were some super chats. Thank you so much for that.
Appreciate it.
We appreciate everyone's support.
I want to thank Lori and Michael for your support as well. And that's it.
Yep. Couldn't do it without you guys.
Absolutely. So it's always fun. Glad we came back to do this. I'm sorry about the cough.
That's fine. Hey, don't feel sorry
rest.
for me. We just came back from a cruise. So.
Which she coughed throughout all that week. It was,
I know when I was talking to everyone,
good weather, sunshine, still had the cough.
And great people. We really got to meet a lot of wonderful people. So we really enjoyed that.
We're going to get you fixed up.
Yeah. It's minor. It'll be gone.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful night.
We'll catch you next time.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.